Welcome to Haven Horizons Lunch and Learn. The conversation over the 6 weeks, including how the lack of media reporting guidelines on domestic abuse can shape public understanding in ways that are often maybe misleading, harmful, maybe unintentionally lacking sensitivity towards victims and families. And so we're going to today, we've gone through all of the inputs by the speakers, and we're going to go through the issues raised, picking out the themes that were raised. And then what we're going to do is we're going to put all that together after today. And as requested by Susan McKay, the press ombudsperson, who was also one of the speakers, we are going to send a submission to Susan, who will forward it to the editors group, and we'll keep people updated on the progress of that. So Sarah will now do a quick review of the 6 speakers, and then she will talk about the first theme, about generally what we need to consider when devising guidelines. So over to you, Sarah.
Thanks a lot, Madeline. So we basically, apart from myself and Madeline, we had 6 speakers, and in no particular order. We had Susan McKay, who Madeline just said there is the Irish press ombudsperson. She's also, a very well-known journalist. Susan Leahy, professor in the School of Law at the University of Limerick. Sonia McMullen, regional services manager for Women's Aid Federation Northern Ireland. Jane Gilmore, a writer and academic from the Fix It project, which she set up, which is very well known. Luke Harte, an activist, also very well known on the speaking circuit. Christine Doherty, an academic and ex-journalist. So on that list, we were lucky enough to have an array of expertise, and we had 3 people who have worked our work as journalists, which was pretty important, I think, for kind of a project like this. So just in terms of devising guidelines, 3 people specifically said, Susan McKay, Susan Leahy and Sonia McMullen, that the guidelines mustn't be too prescriptive. And Susan McKay said that they should be broad. Jane Gilmore said that any guidelines, and there was a lot of agreement on this point, should be devised in cooperation with journalists rather than imposed. They should consider, practically as well, Jane said that they should consider the restraints and limits that journalists operate under for them to be adopted. So that's just a very pragmatic way of looking at it, and I think that's correct. Basically, all 6 speakers agreed that when you get to the actual process of devising the guidelines, not only should they be broad and not too prescriptive, but you should cooperate with various stakeholders to devise the guidelines. Sonia McMullen actually was involved with developing the Responsible Reporting Matters Northern Ireland guidelines, which came out in 2019 and then were reissued in 2025. And she said that to develop those guidelines, which are very good, they had key stakeholders, both voluntary and statutory, including health and social care trusts, with domestic abuse partnerships and journalists all working together on that. And the last point that Sonia made was that the guidelines, any guidelines, would need to be updated regularly to respond to the changing landscape in terms of technology and how perpetrators abuse using that technology. So over to you, Madeline.
What we're going to do is, if anyone has any comments on the themes or questions, you can just put up your hand and we'll come to you after we cover the theme. So if anyone has any questions on the guidelines, we can come back to that then. But the next theme really that came out quite strongly was the consideration, I suppose, of the impact of media on survivors of domestic, sexual and gender-based abuse. And I mean, in particular, the impact on survivors who agreed to provide personal testimony to the media, maybe without training in the area. So Professor Susan Leahy, her research covered a lot of those areas, and she said protocols are definitely necessary in media organizations to support victims who share their stories, and to maybe explain to them that what they share may not be exactly what appears in the media, including outlining what impact sharing their personal story might have after publication, and that if the protocol could be in terms of victims of domestic, sexual and gender-based violence and abuse, that this wouldn't be normal, but that possibly there should be the okay that the victim and people could read the piece pre-publication, and possibly to explain after the fact why a victim's story or some of their story might not ultimately be used after the trauma of them giving it. Luke Harte said that victim survivors are more than just one experience or one abusive relationship, and that guidelines could help give them dignity. So there was, interesting conversations around how you could put that together in terms of guidelines. So does anyone want to say anything about that? Or we can wait to the end and take the questions, but if anyone feels they really want to make a comment at any point, feel free to do, and then we'll come to people at the end as well. So Sarah, you were going to talk next about what the speakers said about training. And the necessity of training.
Yeah, but just before I say that, I would say there, your last comment there was about Luke Harte talking about victim survivors, and that victim survivors were more than just one experience or one abusive relationship. I mean, he spoke very powerfully on that, because obviously he felt that his mother Claire and his sister Charlotte, who were murdered by their father, that they were treated with the very opposite of dignity, and they were completely minimized. And so he was very strong on that. Excuse me.
Yes, and I think that this is one of the things we'll be coming to, that whole thing about the survivors not being treated with dignity and perpetrators being portrayed in ways that were inappropriate. So yes, so the training would definitely help with that. Do you want to go ahead, Sarah?
Yeah, so the training, all 6 speakers agreed on the necessity of training. They agreed that it was essential and that it should be for everyone in the newsroom. So not just the journalists, but the editors and the sub-editors. Susan Leahy said the training should not be didactic. It should be collaborative and involve experienced, informed professionals delivering training in newsrooms, explaining why certain words or concepts are problematic. She also made the point that training should include somebody with the voice of lived experience. So that survivor piece again. Jane Gilmore said that training was crucial to dispel the unexamined cultural myths that we are all socialised with, particularly with male journalists who report on crimes involving male violence. She was making the point that all of us in society are socialised in a particular way. Excuse me. But that male journalists who very often report on crime are also subject to those myths. Sonia McMullen said that training journalists via workshops after producing guidelines is essential, and they produced, when they did it, a 1-page document. Sorry, I'm just going to cough and hopefully it'll subside, or else Madeline needs to take over.
Yeah, okay.
So Sonia said that this 1-page document is now up in rooms. And the other thing she said was that they found that they were pushing an open door when they went to deliver training after they devised the guidelines, which is hopeful. Susan pointed out that journalism schools don't really address reporting on domestic abuse and sexual violence. And Christine Doherty advocated for condensed training, equipping journalists to frame stories and recognise red flags. And she felt, which is interesting, that this training might ultimately dismantle structure and change attitudes, as we've done kind of culturally with safety belts and drink driving. So Madeline, over to you in terms of...
Yeah, you were saying there was another bit there where dialogue is needed between journalists, media profession, victim survivors, and as Belfast and Lisburn Women's Aid pointed out, between the organisations that provide support for victim survivors, that they all needed to be part of the conversation. And something else that going back to the bit that Susan McKay said about what happens in journalism schools, and she said that they need to be educated broadly on social issues and then specifically on the things that are really important on specific issues. And we did talk about the suicide guidelines, but one of the things that training should be looking at is that journalists provide context for the issue of, for example, coercive control, that it's not an incident, that it's not a moment of madness, that when this happens, if there's a backstory and a history, it's a progressive pattern of behaviour, and it wasn't, due to jealousy, all those sort of myths that Jane Gilmore sort of alluded to in her work. So that context and dispelling the myths, I think Christine Doherty is right that journalism could have a very powerful part to play in that if the guidelines were written in that way. And that would mean then, of course, that's why you need the training to give them that information. So the next bit that the theme that came out really was the sources.
Would you like Sharon to make her comment? Sorry.
Oh yes, Sharon, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, you've touched on some of that there, Madeline, anyway, my point. But what I was thinking was when you're saying there about Jane Gilmore and, the victim blaming and the myths and all that, that possibly if we were to pose questions to journalists within the guidelines,
Yeah.
are you checking your your language? Is the language used, correct? Have you checked your bias? But
A
the other things,
checklist, yeah.
like a checklist. But the other things, what Jane Gilmore said, and that kind of really stuck with me. She said there were two main themes that came out, every time that she was correcting, with the Fix It campaign. The two main things were, number one, that the perpetrators were invisible. And the second thing was that it was victim blaming. So again, if there was a checklist with questions, is the perpetrator visible? Read through, to make sure that we're kind of fitting within those two main categories.
Okay,
So
yeah. Well, that's a very good point. And we're actually coming to Jane Gilmore's area now, which is the headlines, the sources, the images. And Jane Gilmore said that the sources used after a domestic homicide are important. And we hear this happens everywhere, but I think particularly in Ireland, for example, consulting neighbours after a domestic homicide often misrepresents the reality and dynamics of abuse and results in victim blaming. And we had that this week, this is, a very quiet area and all of that. Neighbours often lack the context on the private, coercive nature of abuse and may give accounts which unintentionally humanize the perpetrator at the expense of the victim and minimizing the abuse. That's exactly what her, as you say, her headlines were. That was what her work was focusing on. And Christine Doherty said that in the Irish context, sources are a problem when reporting on domestic homicide, probably because lots of people think they know people in small areas, but they actually, as Jane said, they don't really know what goes on behind the closed door. Journalists who receive only the bare bone facts from the Garda Síochána, rather than framing of the issue, a resort to problematic sources, the local representatives, very common, bystanders, neighbours, priests. These assorted sources are not in a position to frame the issue or to give that context, and they tend to say positive things about a perpetrator because culturally the Irish do not like to speak ill of their neighbour, or if the perpetrator has also died by suicide, they don't like to speak ill of the dead, and that's distorting the narrative. And images should be chosen carefully. Susan McKay pointed out that media organisations should move away from the image of the cowering child or woman, which is important to have. And she was speaking about this in the context that she wrote Sophia McColgan's story, and Sophia McColgan wanted a picture of her smiling and being positive on the cover of the book. The publishers wanted to put a picture of her as a very small child with her father, but she said, no, I want it to be so that she wasn't defined as a victim. And these images can overtake a survivor's identity outside of their abuse and their capacity for recovery. And when I was looking at this theme, one of the things that occurred to me was, well, newspapers are under those tight guidelines that Christine Doherty also talked about, and anybody who's worked in journalism knows that. And I thought, well, within the guidelines, should we be providing alternative, appropriate images? When we provide that context, then should there also be some images that would be stock images they could go to rather than the fist and the cowering woman? The headlines, as Susan Leahy said, headlines are important, as many people often don't read beyond the headline. They often don't represent what the journalist writing the story intended. They can be sensational, using problematic terms and feeding broader stereotypes. And again, that was very clear that it's a sub-editor who does the headlines. And Jane Gilmore spoke about that what happened at the beginning of her campaign was when she was crossing out the headline and putting in what should have been written, she was tagging the journalists and people started to do it. She started a movement, they're tagging the journalists, and the journalists were coming back saying, I didn't write that headline. So then they started tagging the newspaper and the editor. So that was very interesting. Sonia agreed that Sonia McMullen, who wrote the Northern Ireland guidelines, agreed that sensational headlines and hooks are often problematic, pointing out that in terms of internal media processes, sometimes it could be a night editor that will change a headline that has already been pre-approved. Statistics, Susan Leahy said media reporting on sexual violence is necessarily episodic. It responds to cases that are happening at a point in time. And that's where the inclusion of responsible statistics used in the context is important to give the broader context. Christine Doherty agreed that a problem in the media reports, this thing about reporting domestic violence as a single once-off incident rather than that sequence of behaviour. So if anyone wants to make any comment there or to wait, there's someone, Niamh Maguire, wondering, has the court reporting scheme been considered? I can't see the end of that message. Just hold on, see if I can bring it up there. Wondering in relation to reporting domestic violence. That's we actually were talking to the communications person from the court, so we will be looking at that as part of the submission we make to Susan McKay. So if you want to say anything about that, Niamh, about the media reporting in the court.
Hi, yeah, thanks. I came across it. There's a lot of funding going for supporting this, particularly to improve the accuracy and comprehensiveness of reporting from local and regional courts, so the district and the circuit, which is where all the domestic violence cases, I suppose, are heard. And I had a quick look I had a quick look at how they're currently reported, and some of it's quite shocking. It's like it's reported as like a pantomime, or
Yes,
you can find this out because you can look it up in local and regional newspapers, and all of that data is available for, like, I don't know, online through the Irish newspaper archives that could be analysed and looked at. So
yeah.
I guess it's just something I thought might be interesting.
So I would just say to introduce Niamh. Niamh is a researcher, and your research, you interviewed judges about sentencing. So you're one of the first people in the country to interview judges. So that's really interesting. And that what you're saying was raised, I think it was by Sonia McMullen.
Susan McKay did raise it.
Or maybe Susan McKay, because she was saying that it can be quite like a pantomime, because what the journalists do is they literally take it word for word what the defence barrister says, but the defence barrister is putting it forward a story to try and blame the victim, and then the victim's voice isn't really heard. But Susan McKay pointed out that if a journalist I suppose contextualize what is being said, they can be held in contempt of court. And that happened to her very early in her career. And the judge said that he might have to collapse the case. So that's why. And then Sonia McMullen, one of the recommendations was that journalists don't print what the lies that the defence, or the story that the defence is trying to put across, that they should be very, very careful about putting that, because it can be very sensational and very much, as you say, like that. So that was one of the things discussed as well. So thanks, that's really useful for us to be thinking about and making sure to put that into the guidelines as well. So the next one, Sarah, you were going to look at solution-focused journalism as one of the themes.
Well, it's just really one point that two people made, but it's a good point. It's a strong point. It's that Sonia McMullen and Susan McKay, I think it was, agreed that reports on domestic abuse and homicide, however challenging to read, should be balanced to encourage victims to come forward in a solutions-focused way. And that's something I would have written a fair number of articles myself on: sexual violence, domestic violence, that sort of thing. And it actually never occurred to me ever that, you know, you do have to describe what's gone on in a case, or you're engaging with that case, but that you should be mindful when you're writing it, that if you paint a picture so incredibly bleak, then it discourages survivors from coming forward. So you do have to, you know, you use statistics to broaden the context, but you also be mindful of that, and that you make sure that you put helplines in at the end for survivors, because Luke Harte made a very interesting point, not as it happens in this series, but he made it on another occasion. And he said that he'd seen several occasions where you had domestic homicide, and at the end you had helplines for male mental health organizations.
Yes.
So yeah, that's all really on solutions focused journalism.
Great. And the next one was that the theme was journalistic and legal constraints, which we've just mentioned a little bit there. And Christine Doherty also spoke about that from her time as a reporter, that the training journalists receive is often limited, and their work is limited by the legal restrictions on reporting, very much what Susan said. Greater scrutiny of reports on domestic abuse from the courts because of the potential legal problems, including the risk of being charged with defamation. Also the risk, as Susan said, of a case potentially collapsing due to media coverage, with editors and writers being summoned to court to explain themselves. And Susan also spoke about the language of the offences, that a lot of the offences are still in very Victorian language as a way to describe the crime and the abuse, and that it often sounds very sanitized or very strange when you see the reports. And she said that language needs to be modernized to reflect the reality. And, you know, anyone like Susan and Christine who have been journalists speak about how they're currently operating under constraints. You know, being obliged to describe a name by its legal title, and the demands on journalists. But Jane Gilmore said that legal constraints, while they're preventing reporters from covering a criminal case in certain ways, but her project Fixed It showed that it's possible to write headlines and report responsibly, and place blame where it's due, and make perpetrators visible for what they've done. And she said the Fixed It project came about because of headlines which routinely victim blamed or minimized the perpetrator's abuse. But her almost 500 headlines, she says, shows that it is possible to make the headline match the reality. So Sarah, you were going to just talk then about culture within newsrooms?
Yeah, this came up, you know, throughout various weeks, and it probably at this point won't be a surprise to many people that, you know, as Jane Gilmore said, that newsrooms are typically and male dominated. They're very masculine environments, and they have a culture that, you know, has strong, often misogynistic leanings, and they view domestic violence and sexual violence as women's issues. I mean, they weren't saying that every single person in a newsroom thinks or behaves like that, but they were saying culturally, and that's well known, to be perfectly honest with you. Jane also made a point which I thought was interesting, is that she said there's about 300 or 400 reporters in various publications in Australia, and they're all dedicated just dealing with sport. So they don't write about different things. They're assigned to deal with sport, but there isn't one single reporter that she knows of who is assigned to deal with reporting on domestic abuse. So that's quite a powerful point, I think. And then Christine just made the point, obviously, as a working reporter previously, that, you know, the structural challenges and cultures within newsrooms. We've touched off this already. Just you know, she just pointed out, look, news reports must be written in a particular style and length, and that, you know, it can be very frustrating for journalists when editors and sub-editors change a report, which is absolutely the right, it has to be said, because the papers do have an ethos. So, but it can be frustrating when that's changed to fit an ethos of the paper, and you've actually intended to have a different angle. So that's really that.
I think that's really interesting about not having specific reporters for social or DSGB, because then you don't get that build-up of expertise over time. So that's just so then the area then of the role of media and public understanding, and this actually, I think, went through most of the speakers. Susan Leahy said that zoning in on the perpetrator and portraying him either as a decent person or a monster is equally problematic. And Luke Harte said how dominant media narratives on domestic abuse often excuse perpetrators by attempting to find an underlying logic, you know, to put a reason forward, and to make sense of these what would be senseless killings by holding victims accountable for creating the circumstances they were never in control of. Luke also said that, of course, what's been said right through, that it often engages in victim blaming and rationalizing the murder. Luke would have said the media coverage of his mother's and sister Claire and Charlotte's murder was the reason he became an activist. I mean, there were pictures of his father up a ladder called Mr. DIY, and he was really concerned that the coverage of his father, who then went on to die by suicide, that would actually maybe lead to other men who might read those headlines, and they might follow like the copycat murders, which is one of the reasons that suicide guidelines were brought in, because of the way that people who died by suicide were portrayed and what was happening. And Luke said words and ideas have profound consequences for what the public believes about our reality, and it also shapes how we live. The media mustn't engage in reporting that manipulates or causes the public to view domestic abuse or domestic homicide in a distorted way. Really, really important. He said the role of the media is to help the public see reality more clearly, but they aren't doing that. Guidelines, which are guardrails to orient perspective, are a way to help journalists and therefore consumers of news see the reality of domestic abuse more clearly, and maybe to recognize it in their own relationships. And Jane Gilmore agreed that the words that journalists and editors choose give form to thoughts and perpetuate very powerful, deeply embedded cultural myths around sexual and domestic violence, normalizing these myths for consumers of news. Jane also said targeted reporting is crucial so that men will read it, understand and recognise that all men have some responsibility in preventing domestic abuse and sexual abuse, and that it's not framed solely as a female issue. And also, I suppose that media would also highlight the fact that there are male victims, that it happens in LGBT relationships, but that women and girls are disproportionately affected by all types of domestic, sexual and gender-based abuse. So that's really our summary of the input and the contributions of the speakers. So I want to thank everybody, because I know many people are here today. We're here over the 6 weeks, and they also inputted. We had questions and answers at the end, which were very interactive, very interesting, and we have the transcripts of those as well. So it really has been what we wanted, a really collaborative project. And we're going to do what Susan McKay suggested. We're going to put together all of the information that's come out of this process, and we are going to put that submission into her office, and we will feed back to people the outcome of that process. So as well as that, we will encourage people over the next few weeks, if there's anything else that you think, or anything that you would like included in that report, please send us an email. info@havenhorizons.com, or get in touch with us, and we'll put together that report. We'll also be back in the autumn with a new topic, a gap another gap that we've identified. We will have keynote speakers on that, and then we will do the same process again. So I'd really yes, and one thing that Susan McKay, one point she made really, really strongly, and then RTE picked it up the next day and interviewed her and explained she'd been on our lunch and lair. I don't know if people heard that, was that She said, people don't often realise that the press ombudsperson's office cannot investigate media coverage unless the public make a complaint. So if anyone sees a headline, sees content that they have a problem with, there is a process. Just go on the ombudsperson's website. Just need that. Okay. Go on the ombudsman's and make a complaint. She is very happy then, because this her background is journalism. She was involved in setting up the rape crisis, domestic section, gender-based abuse, child abuse, and now. So this really is what she's interested in, that people become interactive with her office if they have a problem with the way any topic is covered by the media. So we're going to leave it open now if anyone would like to say anything or make any comment. Thank you for watching.